Hello, chances are if you're watching this video, you have OCD. Or you know somebody that is suffering from OCD and you're trying to figure out how to help them the best way possible. So this little segment that I have titled What They Don't Tell You About blank, and I just sort of cover a subtype that that people deal with whenever they have obsessive compulsive disorder. I lean towards pure OCD, pure obsessional, obsessive compulsive disorder, which are people who have mental compulsions, so you don't ever really see them suffering outright. And in fact, you probably wouldn't even know that they had OCD. Most people don't know that I deal with OCD. And so there are so many subtypes with it that I kind of want to just give a segment for each of them, so that way people have a place to kind of vent and to discuss all the crazy stuff that's going on in their head and they don't feel so alone. So my whole goal here is to kind of create a community. And the first subtype that we are discussing is my first subtype that I ever dealt with in my whole life, and it was Harm OCD. And I was very young when I had the onset of OCD. I would say I was probably about 5 years old. And I'm going to get into that in a little bit greater detail, but I kind of want to give a brief outline of what Harm OCD is like and what some of the core fears are and what some of the themes center around and how to help with that. So there are many core fears with Harm OCD. Some of them, it's just a very basic fear of death. You just have a fear, an obsessive fear around death. And I'm going to give you a personal story here. I think I had many core fears whenever it came to Harm OCD, but I remember death being one of the earliest. And we had a good friend. She was from a church that we used to go to, and she had died pretty unexpectedly from cancer. She was okay 1 month, and the next she was gone. And I remember going to her funeral. I was probably about 6 or 7, and she was wearing this kind of white ridged blouse, and it was a very specific type of fabric, I remember. And whenever I went to the funeral, I just couldn't keep my eyes off of that type of blouse. It just kind of drew me into it, and my brain was like, this is strange, you know. And I started to avoid wearing those types of blouses, and I hated touching them. Like if I was in a store or something, if I was in Macy's or Kaufman's, which isn't around anymore, but if you're there and they sold those types of blouses, I would just avoid them and walk away or not touch them. And so I had this fear that if I were to wear it or touch it, then I would die, which was completely unreasonable. But when you're a child, you don't really have the necessary components to say, hey, that's a very unreasonable, outlandish way to think about it. But that was one of the first core fears I remember that I had, was this fear of death. Another fear is becoming someone sinister. So, you don't want to become Jeffrey Dahmer, okay? Or you don't want to be a serial killer. Those types of things like really freak you out, and they make you hyper-focus on those types of cases. Another really big core fear that I see with Harm OCD is this fear of the afterworld, and I don't mean it in a religious OCD context, and I can talk about religious OCD as a subtype later on, but I mean just in general, this fear of an afterworld, or of hell, or even the legal system could be technically the afterworld to you. You fear the impending doom or the fear of being locked away or forced in confinement or something that is going to happen to you to where you can't get out. And I see that a lot with Harm OCD, is just this fear of if you do something wrong, you can never reverse it. And so that's kind of another core fear that I see. So it's very broad. It can consist of many different types of themes. So murder, suicide, mass homicide, mass shootings, serial killers, you name it. Harm OCD will latch onto anything. Sometimes it's really specific to the person as well. And this is really important because if you watched my video on being misdiagnosed with OCD, then you know that it's really common for therapists to not really understand the crux or the zenith of OCD, which is that it will attach onto literally anything. So sometimes it's very unique to the individual that is suffering from it. Other times it's very broad. So Harm OCD can contain a plethora of different themes. So my story of Harm OCD began whenever I was about 5, and this was the first time I had ever experienced anything with OCD, and it was rather traumatic. I had watched something with a killer, and my grandfather was showing me it, and it was a very traumatic experience because I was so young. And it was on the serial killer that was acquitted named Lizzie Borden. And I remember him even singing, like, there's a nursery rhyme to it, and he was singing it to me, and he even said that, like, my eyes looked like hers, and it was just a really crazy experience, and I went home and I was crushed. I mean, virtually unable to move, paralyzed with fear, and I just couldn't function for like weeks. And I took off like a whole week of school, and I just couldn't contain what was going on inside of me. And so after a while, you kind of just have to force yourself to ignore it when you're a child, because no one really understands that you have pure O unless you are introspective enough to realize that you're dealing with it. So people can go years and years and years without knowing that they have OCD. And so as a child, I just thought, that this type of obsessional thinking is normal. And I started to fear that I would kill my parents or hurt my parents. And so I would stay away from sharp things and sharp objects and remove myself from situations where that was happening. I remember even whenever I was a little bit older, I I refused to learn like the safe code because that had weapons in it, and I didn't want to know it in case I would go berserk and kill people. So all of these things that were happening, and I had noted them, but I was a child, and so I didn't really know, and nobody else really knew that I was dealing with these things. And so it took me many, many years for me to figure out, hey, something's off here. Other people don't really obsess as much, or they don't, have these compulsive behaviors like I do. And so really what happened to me is whenever I was a teenager, I started to try to deconstruct that. And I remember learning about ERP, and it was so difficult to expose myself to things that scared me. But I did it all on my own, and I didn't have any treatment at all for it. Had no therapy. It was just me learning how to expose myself to the things that I had feared. And so ERP was really the way that I helped myself through that. And again, it was a traumatic experience, and no child should have to go through what I went through. And I'm sharing with you this story because I know there are lots of other people that have dealt with traumatic experiences, especially surrounding Harm OCD. So again, death is a very big thing that prompts this fear. And so another thing that helped was philosophy on free will. So Albert Camus and Jean-Paul Sartre, all of these philosophers really helped solidify the fact that I have free will over myself and I don't have to listen to the OCD to function. And so ERP and philosophy were really big factors in how that I cured myself or managed these thoughts. So I hope that this video helps you in some way, in some regard, and I can make a part 2 if you would like. But I hope all of you have a lovely day, and comment down below if you're suffering from it and you need help. Again, go check out an OCD, and I will talk to you guys later. Thank you.